Before we begin our story, let me provide some cultural context for our international audience. This tale takes place in Japan, where camping in remote mountain areas is a popular activity among university students. In Japanese culture, there's a deep-rooted belief in spirits and supernatural entities that inhabit natural spaces, particularly mountains and forests. The concept of abandoned places or haikyo holds special significance in Japan. These locations are often believed to retain spiritual energy from their past. The practice of exploring unknown locations using digital maps has become increasingly common among young people, though it can lead to unexpected encounters with Japan's spiritual realm. Rural Japan is dotted with mysterious concrete structures, often abandoned facilities whose original purpose has been forgotten over time. Now let's begin our story. I want to tell you about something that happened when my friends and I went camping in a remote mountain area. It was just before summer vacation started at university when I received a phone call from my old high school friend Michael. Michael and I had gone to different colleges, so we didn't see each other as often as before, but he would call me from time to time like this. During that conversation, he suggested that our old high school group should get together and do something fun after such a long time apart. As soon as summer vacation began, we all gathered at Michael's apartment. The group consisted of me, Michael, and two other friends, David and Chris, the four of us who had been especially close during high school. At first we talked about what we'd been up to recently, but eventually we got to the main topic of what we should do together. However, even though we had gathered, no one could come up with any good ideas. While we were discussing this, Chris, who had been quietly using Michael's computer instead of joining our conversation, suddenly spoke up. "How about we go camping at some random place I find on Google Maps?" Michael, David and I all responded with confused "huh?" But Chris seemed quite serious about his suggestion. "No, really, doesn't that sound interesting, going camping at a completely random destination that none of us know anything about?" He seemed quite proud of his idea. Well, I had to admit that such a spontaneous adventure did sound somewhat appealing. As I was thinking this, David seemed to agree as well. "Alright then, let's search for campgrounds and see what comes up." But Chris had other ideas. "Wouldn't that be boring though? Instead of looking for actual campgrounds, how about we find somewhere really remote, like deep in the mountains, where there are no people around?" That did sound interesting. At the time we all thought it was a great idea. So we started searching around for mountain-like locations, and eventually found a spot in a region of western Japan. The area had no houses nearby, just a single forest road running through it. When we zoomed in on the map, we could see it was by a river with an open area that looked perfect for camping. Since we were all from eastern Japan, we knew very little about western Japan, and geographically this location seemed to match exactly what we were looking for. We decided that would be our camping destination. On the day of departure, we piled into Chris's beat-up compact car that he had bought with money from his part-time job, and set off. We arrived near our destination that evening. That night we had dinner and took baths at a nearby public bathhouse, then slept on benches in a local park. The next day, we bought 3 days' worth of water and food at nearby convenience stores and supermarkets, then headed for our destination. As we followed the mountain road deeper and deeper while checking our phone's GPS, we eventually lost all cell phone signal. However, since the road we had been following was the forest road we had found in our search, we continued straight ahead and successfully reached the open area that was our destination. When we arrived at the site, the place was much better than it had appeared in the Google Maps satellite photos. There was a clean river flowing right next to it, and the open area along the river was quite spacious with no dampness at all. We immediately began preparing our campsite. We unloaded our luggage from the car, set up our tent, arranged stones to make a fire pit, gathered firewood, and dug drainage ditches around the tent as protection against rain. Since we had arrived early, we finished all the work by around 2 p.m. For a while we just relaxed by the river, skipping stones on the water, when Michael made a suggestion. We're bored anyway, so how about we explore the area a bit? Since we were all bored, no one objected to the idea. We crossed to the other side of the river where it was narrow, and headed up the gravel road on the opposite bank that we had noticed when we arrived. After walking for a while, we came across a side path where the forest opened up, revealing a small building with white concrete walls. The building was a single-story rectangle, sitting alone in the mountains, but it was surprisingly clean and well maintained for such a remote location. However, we couldn't tell what purpose the building served just by looking at it. There were few windows, and all of them had their blinds closed, making it impossible to see inside. It looked like it might be some kind of management office, but there were no other buildings in the surrounding area. I said, "What is this? It's not a house, so what could it be?" But no one had any idea what it was. We decided to explore the area around the building. Through our exploration, we discovered that this building appeared to be abandoned, or at least not currently in use. The reason was simple. While the front area was covered with gravel, making it less noticeable, the back was overgrown with weeds, clearly having been neglected for years. Then Michael, who was at the front of the building, called out to us, "Hey guys, come over here and check this out." When we went to where Michael was, we found that he had opened the building's door. Chris said, "Dude, isn't that going a bit too far?" David asked, "Wasn't it locked?" Michael replied cheerfully, without any sign of guilt, "It wasn't locked at all. The doorknob turned and it opened right up." Then I added, "But this building is obviously abandoned, right? Since the door was already unlocked, it should be okay to just take a quick look inside. Aren't you curious about what kind of building this is?" When I said that, Michael agreed, and David and Chris didn't seem seriously opposed either, saying, "I guess it's okay for just a quick look." We decided to go inside. Inside there was no furniture or fixtures of any kind. The room had apparently been abandoned for a long time, and was very dusty. There was just one rectangular room, about the size of a small studio apartment. But what was strange was that there was a staircase leading downward in the center of the room. All four of us fell silent. Given the situation, there was no way we could avoid going downstairs at this point. The question was who would be the first to suggest it. But this suspicious building with stairs leading to an underground area was so obviously creepy that none of us could bring ourselves to say the words. After a moment of silence, David was the first to speak. "It's completely dark down there, isn't it? We don't have flashlights, so shouldn't we get properly equipped and come back tomorrow?" It was a reasonable suggestion. I was grateful to David from the bottom of my heart for making this proposal. However, Chris suddenly said, "Can't we just use our phone screens for light?" And Michael seemed to agree with him. David and I could see that if we backed down here, the other two would definitely tease us for being cowards. To be honest, I was scared, but we ended up deciding to go downstairs together. The staircase wasn't very long. When we reached the bottom, it was pitch black and hard to see clearly, but it appeared to be a square room about the size of a small bedroom. What was different from upstairs was that, for some reason, there was a bathtub from a unit bathroom placed in the center of the room. There seemed to be nothing else in the room besides that. When we shone our phone lights into the bathtub, we could see traces of something having been burned inside. But whatever had been burned had been removed, leaving only black soot and nothing else unusual. We were somewhat disappointed, thinking, "Is that all there is?" and decided to return to our campsite. As we were climbing the stairs, I felt what I can only describe as a human presence. You know how you can sense when someone brings their face close to you from behind. I was startled and turned around, but there was no one behind me at the back of the group. The other three asked, "What's wrong?" But I told them it was nothing, just my imagination, and continued up the stairs. When we returned to our campsite, quite a bit of time had passed and it was already close to 5 p.m. We prepared and ate our dinner. That night, the four of us were sitting around the campfire having various casual conversations, when I noticed that David kept looking behind him, turning around repeatedly. I asked, "David, what's wrong? Is something there?" David replied, "Oh, well, no, it's nothing." And then he went quiet. It was a strange reaction. The other two were also curious, so Michael said, "Hey David, if something's bothering you, just tell us. You're making us more worried." Chris also said, half jokingly, "If you keep it secret, it just makes it scarier." Then David said, "It's really nothing, it's just that I feel like someone's watching me. But it's obviously just my imagination, right? There's no sign of anyone else besides us." It was indeed a strange story, but it reminded me of what had happened earlier, and I started to feel uneasy too. Michael and Chris were also concerned, so we all decided to check the surrounding area with flashlights. We shone our flashlights in various directions, but we couldn't see any human figures or animals. Then Chris suddenly exclaimed, "Whoa," and turned toward me. He asked me, "Were you just standing right behind me?" Of course, I hadn't done anything like that. I told Chris I hadn't approached him and asked him to explain what happened. According to Chris, he had felt the same sensation I had experienced during the day, like there was someone's face right behind him. Something was definitely wrong. As I was thinking this, Michael, who had been looking toward the river by himself, came over to us. "Hey, something's not right. There's something here," I said. "What do you mean something? Be more specific." Michael said he didn't know what it was, but he had been continuously feeling eyes watching him and sensing a presence. His explanation wasn't very clear. Thinking we weren't getting anywhere, I suggested we all go into the tent, and we decided to do just that. Once we were in the tent and had calmed down a bit, I told the other three about what had happened during the day. It turned out that Michael and David had felt the same sensation. In other words, all four of us had felt the presence of someone behind us. After a moment of silence, Chris said, "Isn't this place kind of dangerous? The car is nearby, so how about we go down to the base of the mountain and come back for our stuff during the day?" Michael also said, in a tone quite unlike his usually confident self, "That might be better. Maybe that building was some kind of bad place." David seemed to agree with Michael and Chris, saying that our belongings probably wouldn't be stolen anyway, so we decided to head to the car for now. At that moment, the wind picked up outside and the trees began rustling. Mixed in with that rustling sound, we could hear something else. When we listened carefully, though we couldn't make it out clearly, we could hear what sounded like human voices carried on the wind. It sounded like someone singing. This was seriously dangerous. That's what I felt at that moment. We steeled ourselves and stepped outside the tent. Then we walked quickly toward the car. At that point, David saw something in the direction of the car. I say saw something because the rest of us couldn't see anything. David suddenly stopped, began shaking violently, pointed in the direction we were heading, and screamed, "Ni-re, iri, al-mazit," direction from the car. We shouted, "Hey David, wait, stop," and chased after him. David crossed the river and ran up the gravel road in the opposite direction from the building. We had no choice but to chase after David without understanding what was happening. After running for a while, David suddenly stopped, changed direction by 90 degrees, and headed down toward a valley, leaving the road entirely. The three of us followed after him. As we ran through the off-road area while shining our flashlights, I stepped wrong and fell into what seemed to be a depression in the ground. I hit my back on the ground and couldn't breathe for a short while. As I groaned and got back up, I could hear Michael and Chris calling for David in the distance. Apparently they hadn't noticed that I had fallen and had continued on ahead. I moved my arms and legs to check for injuries. I didn't seem to be hurt, and aside from the pain in my back where I had hit the ground, nothing else hurt. During this time I could no longer hear Michael and Chris's voices. I thought I had to get out of there. So as I climbed out of the depression, I felt that presence behind me again. Fearfully, I turned around and shone my flashlight. Nothing was there. I felt somewhat relieved and began walking unsteadily toward the valley where David and the others had run down. When I reached the valley, I thought I should look for everyone, so I shouted loudly, "Hey, Michael, David, Chris, are you there?" But there was no response. Then I felt that presence behind me again. And this time, it wasn't just that. Carried on the wind, I heard the same singing voice we had heard at the campsite. And although I still couldn't make out the words clearly, it was closer and clearer than before. A cold, unpleasant sweat broke out all over my body. The singing voice gradually got closer. Fighting my fear, I turned around and shone my flashlight into the darkness. But again, there was nothing there. The singing became even clearer, approaching to within about 20 or 30 meters, but for some reason I couldn't move at that moment. As I stood there unable to move, the singing voice came very close. I still couldn't understand what the lyrics were, but I could barely make out that it seemed to be some kind of folk song. In my confusion, I looked around frantically, shining my flashlight everywhere, when I sensed multiple presences around me. But although I could sense these presences, I couldn't see any figures anywhere. Even though I couldn't see them, I could clearly tell that something was there. It made no sense. In this situation, alone in the darkness and fear, I had completely lost my composure. At that moment, someone whispered something right behind me. I could even feel the warm breath of the whisper. Feeling a terror unlike anything I had ever experienced, I turned around and shone my flashlight. But again, there was nothing there. Nothing was there, yet I could clearly feel the breathing of something right in front of my face. I had reached my limit. I ran at full speed in the opposite direction from where the singing was coming from. Tree branches and thorn-like plants hit my body, creating small cuts all over. But I didn't stop running. After running for I don't know how long, I came out onto a fairly wide paved road. By the time I reached the road, the singing and the presence had disappeared. I felt a bit relieved and checked my phone screen, hoping for the best. But it was still showing no signal. I had no choice but to start walking aimlessly down the road, thinking that if I kept walking on such a wide road, I would eventually reach somewhere. After walking for a while, I heard the sound of a car coming from behind me. I'm saved, I thought as I waited. I could see car headlights in the distance, gradually approaching. To make myself visible, I moved slightly toward the center of the road and shouted at the top of my lungs, "Please help me." When the car was almost upon me, something strange happened. Someone was gripping both of my ankles. I was being held quite firmly. My feet hurt and I couldn't move at all. Still, I continued shouting loudly, because I thought that if I missed this car, that thought was more terrifying than anything else. Finally, the car came right up to me and stopped suddenly with screeching brakes right in front of me. It was an obviously expensive foreign car, and out of it came a man who looked like he was connected to organized crime, shouting angrily. Normally I would want nothing to do with people like this, but this was an emergency. I was prepared to ask this man for a ride no matter what happened afterward. The man was shouting angrily as he opened his door, but suddenly his face contorted as he looked behind me, and he quickly shut his door and drove away. What? I was stunned. My feet were still being held. From the man's reaction, I knew there was something behind me, but I was too terrified to turn around. Then I heard that singing voice from behind me again. And not only that, but an intense smell of decay began to drift toward me. I tried with all my strength to move my feet, but they wouldn't budge. As I twisted my body, I lost my balance and collapsed on the spot. Still, I was too frightened to look behind me. Fortunately, when I fell, the hands gripping my feet let go. I crawled away from that spot, then got up and ran with all my might. At this moment, I turned around and saw something behind me. That much is certain. And I'm also certain that what I saw filled me with terror unlike anything I had ever felt before. But when I try to remember it now, I somehow can't recall what I saw. People reading this will probably think it's strange, but that's the only way I can describe it. I only have the memory of seeing something terrifying. I think I probably ran for more than a kilometer. The cell phone in my pocket suddenly rang. Apparently I had made it down to an area with cell coverage. When I answered the phone, it was Michael. I could hear Chris's voice in the background too. Michael asked, sounding very worried, "Hey, are you okay? Where are you now?" I told him I was safe and that I was on a main road. Then asked, "What happened to David? Is he safe?" According to Michael, David was also safe, and the three of them were together in what looked like a material storage parking lot. From what I could tell from our conversation, they seemed to have come down the same road I had. As I walked while talking on the phone, I could see the three of them after a while. Since we had fled the campsite, quite a bit of time had passed, and the sky was beginning to turn white. When I rejoined the three of them, David was sitting on the edge of the parking lot, staring blankly into space. I explained to everyone what had happened after we got separated. Then David said, "Yes, that's it. That's what I saw too." He said he couldn't remember the shape or form at all, but he clearly remembered that there was something terrifying there. When I asked Michael and Chris if they had seen anything like that, they both said they hadn't. However, while chasing David, they had continuously felt a presence in eyes watching them from behind. As we talked, the sun rose and the surroundings began to brighten. When we checked our location on our phone's map, we found that we had somehow made a big detour from the campsite and ended up near a different mountain pass, but it was still within walking distance. We really didn't want to go back, but our belongings and car were there. We had no choice but to return. It took us 3 hours to walk back to where we had been camping. When we returned, at first glance nothing had changed, and our belongings, tent and car were all just as we had left. However, despite having no concrete reason, all four of us were inwardly nervous that that thing might come back. When I tried to enter the tent to pack up our belongings inside, that intense smell of decay came wafting out. I exclaimed, "Ugh," and fell backward. Michael, David and Chris, who had been packing things elsewhere, came over to see what was wrong. When I said, "This is bad, I can smell that odor coming from inside the tent," David backed away with a pale face, saying seriously. Michael said nervously, "I guess we have to check inside from the outside somehow, right?" So we tried poking with sticks and throwing stones from outside to see if there was any reaction from inside. However, there was no response and no sense of any presence. Chris cautiously peered through the tent window and said, "From what I can see, there doesn't seem to be anything inside." I steeled myself and opened the tent entrance to look inside. Our belongings were still there as we had left them. As far as I could see, aside from the smell, nothing seemed unusual. However, looking more carefully, I noticed that the center area of the tent was blackened with soot, as if there had been a small fire there, and the smell of decay was particularly strong in that area. We removed all our belongings from outside while trying not to breathe in the smell, then thoroughly washed the tent in the river to completely remove the odor. After packing our belongings, we quickly fled the area. On our way back, we stopped in a small town at the base of the mountain and casually asked around, but we never found out what that thing was. In fact, it would be more accurate to say that the mountain itself had no legends or stories associated with it at all. Since then, nothing in particular has happened to any of us, and to this day we still don't know the truth about what occurred that night. However, I am still somewhat afraid of the darkness. Not constantly, but sometimes when I'm in complete darkness, I become anxious that I might hear that presence or singing voice coming from the black void. This concludes our tale of terror from the Japanese mountains.